night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Welcome to the show, everyone. I hope I can remember how to do this. It seems like so long since we've had one of these. And I know it's completely my fault, and I apologize for that. But there's just so much going on. It makes it a little bit difficult, and I'm trying to juggle a whole bunch of things, as you all know. And I appreciate your patience and your support at every step of the way. But anyway, welcome. We've got a great show tonight. We are going to be talking about a true crime story that is fascinating to me as I got to know it. And the funny thing is I didn't really remember this story when it was happening. And it wasn't, it was a while ago. It was 30 years ago. However, it was, in the smack middle of my life, and I should have remembered it, but I really didn't. And maybe it was because of everything else that was going on at the time in the world. But we'll get into that. Our guest tonight will be Jett. He is an attorney and an author, and his new book is what we'll be talking about. The book is called Taking Mr. Exxon: The Kidnapping of an Oil Giant's President. That book will be released May 1st of this year. He's also got a book out called The Death of an Heir: Adolf Coors III and the Murder That Rocked an American Brewing Dynasty. That murder took place, and that kidnapping and murder took place in 1960. The one we're going to be talking about tonight, primarily about the taking of Mr. Exxon, that took place in 1992, I think was the year. So it's a little more contemporary. But it's going to be a great conversation nonetheless. I'm really looking forward to this, and thank you all for being here. Make sure you subscribe here on YouTube and also on Twitch if you're a Twitch user. That the Twitch channel features just our live stream, obviously, but the YouTube channel has the live stream and the archive of programs. If you're interested in going back and checking out some of our previous interviews and episodes, they're all there. There's quite an archive, and it's free. So just enjoy yourselves. Go back and check out all of those different shows. There's a lot of great guests that we've had over the course of the years. So anyway, yeah. So as you're commenting here, you notice I had to do some rearranging in the studio, and I'm kind of happy with the outcome. And I got this little thing. I can do this, which is kind of fun. I can actually do stuff like this. So let's see if it works here. Maybe it's not going to work for me. Oh yeah, it did. It was working, but I'm watching the stream, which is delayed. That'll get you every time. Anyway, let's see here. What else do we have to talk about? Oh, by the way, if I've seen some people mention the other show that I'm doing, and if you're interested in exploring that, it is a political show, and you can find that channel by going to the Independence Gang. It's right here on YouTube. For now, anyway. So if you just search the Independence Gang, you'll find it pretty simply, and we'd appreciate subscriptions there as well. Having a lot of, I don't know if fun is the word. I guess I feel like I'm contributing to what is an important political dialogue. That's what I'm hoping is the outcome of all of this. And yes, Gene, the show tonight is about the kidnapping of Sidney Russo. Yes, that is absolutely right. And it's an amazing story, and our guest tonight has written a book about it, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say, because the true crime stuff is really quite fascinating to me. So we'll go to break. When we come back, we will have our guest again. Jett is the author of the book we'll be talking about tonight, and he will be with us in just a moment. It's Beyond Reality, and we'll be right back.
Hey, it's JV here. You know I've asked for your support in the past, and I'm going to do it again because it's really, really important. And there are a couple of ways you can support the show, and it's so inexpensive. Now, you can go to Patreon, and you can become a Patreon supporter, and we really, really encourage that. But there's also another way. If you look at the description of the podcast, if you're a podcast listener, and you scroll down to the bottom, there's a way to support the show directly through the podcast app. And it's only 99 cents a month. It's less than $1. You probably have that change in your couch right now. That $1 a month, less than $1, goes a long way in helping us produce this program, provide great interviews for you during the course of the week. I thank you in advance because the support is so important to the program.
Thank you to everyone for being here tonight, whether you're listening on one of the great broadcast stations that we're on, or you're listening through one of our streams, or you're listening as a podcast listener. We appreciate all of your ears and eyes and your minds, and thank you for your support regardless of how you're enjoying the show. Tonight we're going to be talking about a very interesting true crime story, and it's actually one that it seems like I should be more aware of. And I vaguely remember the story, but there was a lot going on at the time crowding the news, and that's probably why it may not have gotten as much attention as maybe I would have remembered it having, or thinking it deserved anyway. But I'm excited to talk about this. Our guest tonight, Philip Jett, is an attorney. He's also an author. He's written a book called Taking Mr. Exxon, The Kidnapping of an Oil Giant's President. That book will be released in just a week or so on May 1st. Philip, welcome to Beyond Reality. It's really great to have you with us tonight.
Oh, it's great to be here. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. It happens. Let's talk a little bit about you before we get into your work and the books and the stories that we're going to talk about tonight. But, I was reading through your past experience as an attorney and, a pretty high-powered guy for quite some time. Then you decided to shed all of that for a bit of maybe a calmer lifestyle. Tell us a little bit about your path and how you got here.
Yeah, it's funny where we end up. I have two sons. They're in their early 20s, and I always say to them, we don't know where life's going to take us, And I started practicing law and went to school in New York. I went to NYU and then moved to Nashville and worked for a large firm and did corporate practice. And here, we have country music. We have athletes, we have all sorts of things. And I was fortunate to represent a lot of those people, including Fortune 500 CEOs and that sort of thing. But, it's funny when people say kind of a midlife crisis. For me, it was a reevaluation. And I'm like, do I want to work this hard the rest of my life, And so I decided to curtail my practice and eventually retired. And now I write books instead of playing golf, I write books.
There's something therapeutic for some people, not everyone, but for some people about writing. What do you find therapeutic about writing, or where do you get most of your satisfaction about writing from?
Yeah, it's strange, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because I tell people that I'm most at peace when I'm writing. I don't know why. First of all, I love it, and I love the research that goes along with it. I write nonfiction only, which sort of borrows from the practice of law. And but when I sit down to write, or even thinking about writing, I feel more at ease than I do at any other time. And it's almost like people who meditate. For me, it's almost like that.
And that's a great way to put it. And one of the other things that I find when I talk to authors, people who are really passionate about this, is not only is it therapeutic in a way, but when you're writing, you kind of, almost another personality kind of takes over from within you. Is that true of you as well?
Well, it is. Having practiced law for many years, you tend to lose your individual self. You become kind of a machine. And, with writing, what I've discovered was my creative side. There is some creativity in the practice of law, but in writing, I discovered, I don't write poetry. I'm not a painter, but this is the closest thing, and I feel more kin to those who are artists, or in that type of sphere, because I do create, even if it's nonfiction, even if it's a story that's already out there. You have to go research it, and I'm very diligent about that. And I actually love the research, probably more than the writing, to tell you the truth. But it's fun. But you research it, you organize your thoughts, you organize the story, you put it on paper. So you are creating somewhat. You're taking all these facts, and sometimes they amount to boxes full of facts, and you organize them in a fashion that hopefully tells an interesting story.
There's something about going out and lifting up the rocks and looking underneath and see what you can find, especially when it's involved in some type of maybe a true crime story or a high profile news story, or just a mystery. But something about that search, it's almost a treasure hunt in a way.
It is. And when you discover something that's been lost for decades, or maybe never known, you feel like you found the Holy Grail. Yeah. And this is my second book, my first book was similar. It was about the kidnapping and murder of Adolf Coors III of the Coors Brewing Company. And both of these books, the story had not been told in book form. It was contemporary newspapers, magazines, that sort of thing. So a lot, especially in Coors and somewhat in the Exxon book, a lot of the facts were lost to time. And, and I went back and resurrected them. And so that's kind of a cool part of what I do.
Tell me a little bit about how you steered yourself to this true crime angle, to looking at these cases, which both of those cases that you've written about are fascinating, and I think a little bit undertold, as you said, which makes your timing perfect. But what drew you to that kind of story?
It's funny. It was quite by accident. I didn't set out to write true crime. I knew I wanted to write nonfiction, but I didn't know in what manner. And I came across the Coors story by accident. I was out there taking a tour of the brewery in Golden, Colorado. And if you've ever done that, when you exit, you walk down a more or less a porcelain tile hallway, and they have this wall of fame, I call it, black and white photos from time beginning of all the Coors family and the founder and son and grandsons and that sort of thing. And as I was walking along, being the nerd that I am, I guess sometimes, I noticed that Adolf Coors III disappeared from the wall as I walked along. And so that struck my curiosity as to what happened to him, and I didn't think anything necessarily nefarious. I thought he may have just fallen out of, the family's goodwill. Right. And so I went back to the hotel and Googled it, and then I saw the story. And I'm like, that's an interesting story. I haven't heard that. And so the next reaction was, let me go to Amazon and see if there's any books on the subject. And they weren't. And then I dug more, and I'm like, this story has been lost to time. And, you've seen maybe newspaper and magazine articles about it, but there was no real treatment of the case. And so that's how I got the true crime part, and I enjoyed it very much. And so having success with the first book, a true crime book, I'm like, I'd like to just do another one. And but I did not expect to find as interesting a story as Taking Mr. Exxon, because I thought it too had probably been written about, and it hadn't. There again, it's been in the news and that sort of thing, but nothing as I've treated it, where you go back and you do in-depth research and interviews and all that sort of thing, and put it together in a nonfiction book.
I remember first hearing about the Coors story on Forensic Files, actually, something that I've watched a lot of. Great program. And I remember that episode coming up, and I thought to myself at the time, why have I not heard of this story before? Because that story alone is quite fascinating. Now, you were not a criminal attorney, right? You were more like a business attorney.
No. So, no, it's funny. That was not my area, although I did work in tandem sometimes with criminal attorneys, because in the corporate world, you also deal with tax law, and sometimes, you have clients that are involved in tax evasion or whatever, right, and you have to bring in criminal lawyers or, any other kind of thing. But no, I was not involved in criminal law, and had very little interaction with law enforcement. But now it's funny, some of my best friends, after two books, some of my best friends are former FBI agents, or current FBI agents. It's kind of weird, when my son was in the den last Saturday, and I got a call, and it was from a former FBI agent up in New Jersey who had worked on this case. And he had another FBI agent on the phone with him. And so we sat here and we chatted and we laughed and we talked and we discussed and hung up. And my son's like, only my dad can sit around and talk to FBI agents on a Saturday morning.
That must be really interesting, too. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but to be able to talk to some of the investigators that were involved in the story as it was unfolding, obviously that's great research for the book, but it just must be fascinating in general.
Yeah, part of writing for me has been meeting people, and most people, even in true crime, you meet people who want to talk to you. Although usually the victim's family, they don't want to talk to you, and a lot of times the perpetrator's family are also hesitant, and rightfully so. But you have law enforcement, you have the courts, you have judges, you have all kinds of people that you run into, and it's always a joy to meet people. Like in the Coors case, I went out and hung out in Colorado doing research and interviews, and I was fortunate that I'd gotten there in time because there weren't many people left.
Right.
This happened in 1960.
That's right.
So a lot of people were, in their 80s, and are now deceased. And I got to befriend them, and all these people were super nice. And in the Exxon case, I tell people, I always have sort of protocol I go through, procedures. I reach out to the FBI, I reach out to the Library of Congress, I do all this stuff, the institutions, the entities. But where I find a lot of times, and particularly in Exxon, a lot of the really good information, the interesting stuff came from former agents who, for a lot of these folks, this was the biggest case they'd ever worked. So a lot of them still had copies of files at home, and photos and that sort of thing. And they were very forthcoming and sharing the information. And so I got to see a lot of things that would have been redacted in, institutional files and that sort of thing that I got firsthand knowledge.
It's really, really very interesting, very fascinating. And I want to kind of touch the soul of America here a little bit, because over the past, 5-10 years maybe, there's been this tremendous interest in true crime stories, whether it's Making a Murderer on Netflix or The Staircase, I think that's also on Netflix, or The Tiger King even, I think that's also on Netflix. Obviously, Netflix has found a magic hotspot with these true crime stories, but what is it about a true crime story, even one that's been solved for that matter, that makes it so interesting to people?
Yeah, I think there's several things, and it's a lot of it's individualized. For me, I like a good mystery. I like, even if I know what happened, I want to know the details and what people were thinking and why they were thinking that and how it was done and that sort of thing. And then sometimes there's almost like a dark side to me where, I want to know some of the gory stuff and stuff that we don't, thank God, normally encounter in our daily lives.
Right.
And so that, that's in my case, and I think that's for a lot of people. And, it's funny, in the publishing business, true crime, like most topics, go in cycles. So you can have, like when Coors comes out, true crime can be hot. And then maybe 5 years later, if I write one, it may not be as hot, So there's a hit or miss to that. But generally speaking, I think most of us enjoy a good dark tale occasionally.
I don't know if I should be ashamed to admit it, but I certainly do. In fact, I gravitate to those stories, whether they're true crime.
You should write the books. You write the books, and that's another thing. When I wrote Coors, and then again with Exxon, there's a feeling, you experience certain emotions when you dig up facts, especially sad ones, or where a person suffered and that sort of thing, and then you see details about the families and that. So you go through these emotions where you feel bad or whatever, and then sometimes I feel almost guilty that I'm resurrecting this, from that kind of standpoint. But then again, it just comes and goes. So it's funny you pointed it out. There is a side to me occasionally that I'm like, why am I doing this? It's kind of dark.
It's not too far from just the simple fact that, and I know a lot of people do this, a lot of people just like to walk through a cemetery or graveyard, and there's something about applying a little bit of your personal life's history, looking at somebody's name and their lifespan, and there's a certain morbid curiosity that's within us all. It's why we like horror movies, I think, in a lot of ways too.
Oh yes. Yes. And I love a good horror movie, always have. And I even love the old cheesy, 1950s and 60s horror movies that, are pretty lame by today's standards. But, I'm entertained by that. And the cemeteries, I know that Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, New Orleans, they have these tours through cemeteries at midnight and all that sort of thing. And so, it's I think that's just part of life, that we're interested in death and the other side and the dark side of individuals, and that's just part of it.
We didn't have you on the program to talk about this, but you're starting to sing my song when you start talking about these movies of the 50s and 60s, these campy B movies that are sometimes horror, sometimes hi-fi or sci-fi. They are my favorite films to watch. And you probably know who the director Ed Wood is.
Oh, yes, of course.
Well, one of the surviving actors from his troupe was Conrad Brooks. He's since passed away, but I became close friends with Conrad. And I've been doing this other program on weekends where I play these Conrad Brooks movies. I call it a Conradathon, and we talk about the movies. And they're so bad. They're so bad, but they're charming, Philip. They're just, you can't help but laugh at them, but you want to laugh with them, too. Even though they weren't written to be laughed at, you can't help it. It makes it fun. So I'm right with you on that.
I'm glad to hear that, because you cannot imagine how I don't know anyone. I watch a lot of those films, and people think that there's something wrong with me. They're like, that movie is so bad. I'm like, I know. And I always say, no, it's so bad that it's good.
Absolutely. Yes.
And they don't get that, and and then. The old black and white movies of the 30s, 40s, whether it's sci-fi or horror or not, I enjoy the placement of shadow and all that sort of thing and how it works. And there's just something artistic about it. But the big, the giant tarantulas and, the flying saucers and Dracula and everything that comes out. I mean, I love those things. And they talk about stress relievers. For me, they're a good stress reliever. I don't need pills. I can just watch one of those films.
It's so true. Turner Classic Movies is my favorite channel on cable, and I'm the same way. I get a real sense of peace from these films. I've been watching, this is such a tangent, but I'm glad I found someone who shares this passion too. I've been watching The Maltese Falcon over and over again. What a great film, and when you mentioned Shadows, that immediately thought of that movie. But they're all great, and there's such a serenity to them. Regardless of what the genre of the film is, there's just such a serenity to those movies.
Yeah, and I've run into people who say, I don't watch black and white film, I only watch color. And I can't understand that because, here, since COVID hit, it's not been going on. But the local theater here in Nashville, one of them, once a month they play a classic film. And you can go and have popcorn and sit in a theater and watch. And a couple years ago, I went to see The Maltese Falcon in the theater. Oh, nice. And that was a real treat. To see it up on the big screen, eating popcorn. We're in lockstep there on that sort of thing. It is a tangent, but it's your show, so
and it's fun to talk about because it is a passion. But I want to talk a little bit about both of the books that you've written revolve around a kidnapping murder situation. Let's talk a little bit about the frequency of those types of crimes. Now, the Adolph Kors kidnapping was 1960. The one we're going to be talking about with Mr. Exxon, that was 92, I believe. There's the there's the Patty Hearst kidnapping in the 70s. How common are these high-profile kidnappings?
Yeah, in the U.S., it's not very common. And when I talk to people, when I go, on tour, or I just speak, and people ask me, and I say, in the U.S., I classify them, categorize them as there's been 5 big kidnappings. Lindbergh's baby was number 1. Patty Hearst always gets the attention, although it was a strange kidnapping. It was not really a kidnapping for money per se. There's more of a political motivation behind it, that sort of thing, revolutionary. Then you have the Exxon kidnapping, the Coors kidnapping, and you had Frank Sinatra Jr., which was also kind of a strange kidnapping. But those are the big five. And we've been saturated with Lynchburg's Baby, Patty Hearst, Frank Sinatra Jr., but it's interesting that Coors and Exxon, two biggest names, in corporate America, those weren't noticed. But that does show you that there are not that many. I mean, we have a few, and the ones that go unnoticed are usually, they grab someone and 4 days later, the kidnappers are apprehended and everything goes well and the person's released. So those don't make the news as much. But still, in the U.S., it's very difficult in this day and age, and also in 1992, to have a successful kidnapping. So most kidnappers target someone, and not to pick on any countries, but, South America, Middle East, or other places where, you can be susceptible to kidnapping. In the U.S., technology is such, and law enforcement techniques are such that, as I say, it's easy to grab somebody. It's easy to take someone, usually. I mean, you can conduct surveillance and see their routine, and you can grab them, maybe, being unnoticed. The trick really is to make the exchange the person for the money. And this day and age, that's almost impossible in the United States. And as you'll see in the book, Taking Mr. Exxon, it was impossible in 1992 as well. I mean, they had these helicopters, the FBI, I think they called them night stalkers. They were capable of listening in on conversations from the air of people talking inside a car. They had infrared, and all that sort of thing. So the kidnappers, a lot of these kidnappers think in terms of what they see in the movies, kind of like the old gangster days. And, it's really almost impossible in the U.S. to successfully kidnap someone for money. There's a lot of kidnappings in the U.S. that are what I call domestic situations, where you have an estranged husband or a wife or girlfriend, and somebody snatches one of the kids and crosses state lines and that sort of thing. But that's totally different. The corporate exec kidnappings, that's more occurs a lot more in foreign countries.
Yeah, there's probably some, I guess maybe sex crime type kidnappings that occur still,
right?
Which is a little different. But I've kind of gotten the impression that kidnapping for ransom has kind of gone the way of holding up a stagecoach. It just doesn't. It's a crime that
like Jesse James.
Yeah, it's kind of a crime that's just not. As you pointed out, technology has gotten to the point where it's not something you're going to get away with. And then of course you've got the Jean-Benet Ramsey case, which I know we're not talking about tonight, but that was whatever happened there. There was a ransom note, and it was at least supposed to have been some type of kidnapping for ransom, but I don't really know what happened there.
Having written these two books, and I've just finished a third, but it's not kidnapping and murder. I told my agent I did not want to be known as the kidnapping guy, But having done it, I have met some interesting people. And one surprise has been that corporate security firms have reached out to me, and they have used, Exxon hasn't come out yet, but it comes out May 1st. But the Coors book, I've been told that they use it even as a teaching tool to show how a corporate executive who follows routine, isn't aware of his physical surroundings, that sort of thing, how that can turn out badly. And so it's still a business. You hear occasionally, especially in terms of celebrities, where somebody jumps over a fence or breaks into somebody's house, or, a celebrity comes home, there's someone eating dinner in their kitchen, and, so those things still happen. They're not necessarily kidnappings, but that's still corporate security in the U.S. is still a big business. And overseas, what I'm told is that kidnappings are actually a business but not for big money. For instance, you might be in a country and there's a corporate executive or a manager of a company, and they grab him and then ask for, only $10,000 or $15,000,
right,
in U.S. money, and, don't intend to harm him or her, and, and the company obtains the release, and it's just kind of like a cost of doing business.
right.
And, that happens quite a bit, I'm told. Not these things where, you're asking for millions and that sort of thing. They just have an opportunity. They grab somebody, ask for 10, 15, 20,000, get it, go on their way, And so corporate security firms, it's their job to make sure that doesn't happen, either through security teams or, vehicles and escort vehicles and that sort of thing. So it is kind of a high-tech business in many areas, maybe not so much here in the U.S., but, if you're Bill Gates or whomever and you're traveling, you've got to have security, even if no one intends to. What I remind people of is, don't think that there are people out there that say, I'd like to kidnap so-and-so, but it wouldn't work. A lot of people are delusional or just ignorant, and they think it would work. So it's still possible to get grabbed out there.
Yeah, I was just watching a news program not long ago, and the journalist Glenn Greenwald, who has been moving around a little bit. I'm not even sure where he is right now. I think he works with an online news agency. But he's a respected journalist, and he was telling a story that about a month ago, he was somewhere in, I think, Central America, or maybe it was South America, and they had 5 gunmen break into the home and held them for ransom in the home for a period of time.
Right.
He obviously was afraid for his life. This happened a month ago, and they ended up taking whatever money was in the house and leaving.
Yeah, I ran across a guy 15 years ago. It's a friend, but not a close friend, and he's worth several million. And he told me when he travels, for instance, if he goes to Brazil or wherever, he has security with him because, somehow he said, because we tend to, he said, we rich guys tend to stand out.
Right.
Even, and so when I think about it, I'm thinking nobody's going to grab me, and if they do, they're going to be sadly
disappointed.
mistaken. But he's correct. I mean, if you go to places and you stay at whatever country's Ritz-Carlton, and you have these nice dinners, and there are people who are watching. And looking for their opportunity, or as you mentioned, they know where somebody may be renting a home or staying or living in some kind of vacation home, and they take advantage. It's still a danger, and we just don't hear about it because, fortunately, it hasn't been like in Coors and Riso cases, the Exxon case, they didn't end up murdered.
Let's talk about Mr. Exxon, Sidney Riso. Tell us who he was and give us a bit of his history leading up to this event in 1992.
Yeah, Sidney Riso, he reminds me a bit of myself, other than he was successful. He grew up in New Orleans. He grew up in the South. I grew up in Nashville. And he attended college at Louisiana State, LSU, and received his petroleum engineering degree, and then decided, okay, I'll work for Exxon. And when he started out, I read a funny story where, he was just a new kid on the block, so they gave him this dry oil well out in Texas, and I think it was called New Siberia or something like that. And so he took that well and made it productive and got several millions barrels of oil out of this thing. So that was his first stint and showed what he was capable of. And then 35 years later, he ends up as president of Exxon, and his next step is CEO, which he would have gotten if not for the kidnapping and murder. And, during that time, he was a family man. He had a wife, 5 children. They moved around the world as Exxon will move you. And, some places are cool, like London and Australia, and some places weren't. And then by late 1980s, he's back in Houston, and then he's transferred to New Jersey, in the town Morristown, New Jersey, which is about 50 miles from New York City, as the crow flies. They say, I don't know if crows fly in New York, but I lived in New York City for 6 years. I don't think I ever saw a crow. Lots of pigeons, and so having traveled around the world and that sort of thing, he felt safe being back home in the U.S. and New Jersey, and living in a very nice home, a multi-million-dollar home in a subdivision that's beautiful, 4-acre wooded lots and this whole thing. So it was not a place that you would feel unsafe.
Before we get into some of the details of the crime itself, I just kind of want to take an overview of this, because when I started to look at this information and we set up the interview, I was trying to rack my brain about the press coverage I heard at the time. And honestly, I was a young man at the time, and I don't remember a lot of coverage of this. I kind of remember it in the back of my head, but why did it seem to not get the kind of exposure that it certainly deserved?
Well, and that's a good point, because if it all depends on the news cycle, and if there's nothing in the news, things that aren't that important will run for days. And something like this, the kidnapping of the president of Exxon, would have been, on the news all the time, and television, radio. But what happened was he was kidnapped on the day that the 4 police officers were acquitted in the Rodney King beating trial, and L.A. riots broke out. So that happened on the same day that he was kidnapped. So that, as we all remember that,
sure, and
the coverage, so that absorbed, the top news coverage, and so this kidnapping fell. If we talk newspapers, it would fall toward the back pages rather than being on the front. And it wasn't only until maybe within a week that it started gaining traction in the news. But by that time, we weren't paying as close attention as if it had just happened. And I talked to a couple of FBI agents, and one was the special agent in charge in New Jersey. And he told me that he was out in California at the time, and that they called him and said, look, we just had President of Exxon kidnapped in New Jersey. We need you back. And he said, I can't. I'm out here dealing with the L.A. riots. And so he said it was a week before he could get it back. So what normally would have been front page, given priority, fell a little farther back. And I think that's one reason we don't recall it as quickly, because it was, trumped by the Rodney King issue. And we don't remember the chorus. I don't remember the chorus because I wasn't born. But, the Exxon, that's what I'm thinking. It was just usurped by the L.A. riots at the time.
Do you have any reason to believe, again, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, but do you have any reason to believe that that was intentional by the perpetrators of the crime? Did they recognize that maybe attention would be elsewhere?
No, not at all.
Just coincidence.
That was just purely coincidence, yeah.
That makes sense. So there's some unique things about this particular crime, but one of the things I find very fascinating is that Mr. Risso you'd expect somebody with that level of importance to a major U.S. or major global corporation, for that matter, might have a driver and a limo picking him up and all of this stuff. Tell us how the crime occurred. And I found it very interesting that he was driving himself to work, right?
Yes, first I should say Mr. Exxon, the title taking Mr. Exxon, the reason it's Mr. Exxon, I should have mentioned this earlier, having worked for 35 years for Exxon, people called him Mr. Exxon around the office. So that's how he gained that moniker. But as you say, being the president of Exxon, he had access. He was given access to a corporate limo with a driver, and the driver was trained at avoiding bad situations and dealing with situations that arose even in New Jersey. But Mr. Riso, he was sort of the good old boy from Louisiana, and even though he was making lots of money and he was a multimillionaire by that time, he was very modest. And I tell people that he was no one deserves what happened to him, but he particularly did not. He was a nice guy, a very nice guy, family man, a religious man, a man who gave back to the community. He also was an environmentalist at Exxon, of all places, and he was modest. Yeah, he had a nice home, but I have neighbors who drive, $100,000 cars who really can't afford them, right. Whereas he could have afforded a very nice car, and he drove this little station wagon with a 5-speed transmission and roll-up windows, and you got to kind of like a guy like that, And I found a statement he had made in an interview before his death, and he said, every time if I get feeling too much like a big shot, my wife tells me to go in and wash the dishes, puts me in my place. So, he had a good perspective on, his station, even though he was one of the most powerful corporate executives in the world. And he was a good guy. So he would use a limo if he were traveling to, for instance, go to the airport, or if he was driving into New York City, things like that. But just driving to work every day, that was a 10 or 15-minute drive for him. And so he would just drive himself and get his coffee like everybody else, get his coffee, get his newspaper, and start his day.
Except this day. What happened on the day he was kidnapped?
Well, what happened had been, he did not realize that he'd been watched for several weeks. The kidnappers, they wanted somebody who worked for a company that could pay millions, and they did their homework. They looked around and like, okay, AT&T, Merck, different companies, and they discovered that Exxon had paid a multi-million-dollar ransom in 1973, I think, in South America to obtain the release of a manager down there that was kidnapped by some revolutionary guerrilla fighters or something, So they knew Exxon at least had the mentality to pay ransoms, because some companies are like, we're not paying, But so anyway, they had been conducting surveillance of Mr. Riso, and typically they posed as joggers and would jog along and watch his house in the morning and see what time he'd leave and see if, he left in a limo with a guard or if he drove himself, and what days he typically took a limo, what days he didn't. And so on this day, he drove himself and stopped to get the newspaper. Well, the kidnappers had noticed during their surveillance that he did that every morning. He was a creature of habit, stop every morning at the end of the drive, pick up the newspaper, and go to work. And his secretary, I interviewed his secretary, who still lives in New York City, And she said his habit would be once he arrived at work, he would close his office door for half an hour, read the newspaper, and drink coffee. That was his routine. So this newspaper ended up being a key point in the kidnapping, because this morning the kidnappers jogged along and noticed that the newspaper was on the driver's side. So one of the kidnappers kicked the newspaper to the passenger side, which would make Mr. Riso have to exit the car, walk around the front to pick up the newspaper rather than just scooping it up from the driver's side. So when he did that, the kidnappers were parked down at the end of the street and drove up, and a male kidnapper, he was about 6'2", 210, jumps out with a ski mask and boots and, all dressed in dark colors, black, brown, and he's wielding a .45 caliber pistol, which is a big gun. And he grabs Mr. Riso as he's walking back to the car, grabs him by the collar. Of course, Mr. Riso, he's 57, not in excellent condition. He's been behind a desk his entire life, more or less, and he had a heart attack 3 years earlier. So he wasn't that difficult to physically subdue. And he dragged Mr. Riso to the back of the van, tossed him inside, jumped in with him, and another kidnapper drove the getaway car, in this case a van. And that's how it started. And things went quickly downhill from there.
What was the date? It was 1992, but what date?
It was April 29th. It was April 29th.
April 29th.
And which I think was a Tuesday, if I remember from the book. And, it was in New Jersey in April, it was still cool, but it was springtime was just starting to come out. The trees and that sort of thing still had not leaved. And you could still see, if you were in the house, you could still see to the end of the driveway at that point in time.
So we're basically a week away from the anniversary of that, and your book will be published a couple of days after this. So what, we're talking about 29 years? Is that how long ago it was? Did I do the math right?
It's amazing. Yeah, 29 years. I'm at the age where 1992 doesn't sound too bad, too long ago, but 29 years. And it's funny that, the book's release, that was just by accident because it was intended to be released last year. But with COVID, it was pushed back.
Yeah.
And so it's being released, more or less the day that he was kidnapped.
Let's take a look at what happens from the perspective of Mr. Riso's family and the police, the authorities, and Exxon before we talk about what happened with the kidnappers themselves and what they did with him. So, at what point did the Riso family and authorities realize something was amiss here?
Yeah, very quickly, because. It's funny. I don't think people would take note in my neighborhood, but in this neighborhood, these were everybody was like Mr. Riso. I mean, he had in that subdivision there were the CEO of Merck or AT&T or what have you. They all lived in the same area, and in fact, there was the vice president of Exxon lived in the same subdivision. So they noticed, someone noticed across the street that Mr. Riso's car was sitting in the drive with the door open and the engine running. And, that was clearly looked as something was amiss. So they called the wife and said, has your husband left for work? It's like, yeah, he's left for work. He said, well, his car is still in the drive. And so about that time, she received a call from his office as well saying, he hasn't shown up. Well, probably about, I'm guessing almost an hour had passed with the car sitting there.
Okay.
Which is a lot of time, but then it's not really.
Right.
I could disappear for an hour and nobody would think about it. And that's how it started. So the wife left the house and walked down the drive and looked inside the car, and she knew right away that something was amiss because the car was running. She said he was, a fanatic about shutting the car off and taking the keys, even if, just for a minute. And she saw this briefcase and jacket and everything was in the back seat and that sort of thing. So she went back home to the house and called Exxon, and they first sent Exxon security out to take a look before the other authorities were called. And it didn't take long. And the Exxon, their security is pretty top notch. So as soon as they saw the situation, they called the local authorities, who then called the FBI as well. Typically, FBI doesn't get involved for 24 hours, but this was the president of Exxon, so they're going to come right over. And so you had a situation where, neighbors look out in the morning and they see, a street line with all types of vehicles, with all types of insignias, and, people walking around with FBI jackets or deputy sheriffs and all that sort of thing, just, within 2 hours of him driving to the end of the driveway.
At what point did the first contact come from the kidnappers?
Well, the kidnappers had intended to leave a note in the car that morning when they grabbed Mr. Risso. But what happened was, once they put Mr. Risso in the van, there was a struggle. And Mr. Risso was shot in the arm by the kidnapper. And so the kidnapper panicked and they drove off without leaving the ransom note. So the ransom note did not arrive until the following day. And so on that first day, you had the authorities not knowing that for sure that it was a kidnapping. They thought perhaps, and they have to check this out in every case, they're like, okay, did he leave voluntarily? Had he had enough of the corporate rat race and had some money stashed,
Sure.
maybe a young girlfriend, and off he went. And so they had to check that out. And of course, that was not the case. And then they knew that he had had a heart attack 3 years earlier. And so they thought perhaps he'd had a medical emergency and he was taken to a local hospital. So they had to check that out. Or maybe he had, had some type of episode where he was, unstable and he was walking aimlessly around the neighborhood.
Right.
So they had to check all that out as well, keeping in mind the whole time that, it could be a kidnapping, but that was not the first thing they jumped on. But by that evening, it was pretty well decided that most likely it was a kidnapping, and they were just going to wait for the note, which arrived the next day.
Did it come by mail, or did it come in another fashion?
No, what they did, they never mailed anything to my knowledge. It was always placed somewhere. These kidnappers use payphones, something that some people may not be aware of anymore. But in 1992, there were payphones everywhere. For me, I remember, but having researched this case, every place has a payphone. Every gas station, what have you, they're just everywhere. And so the kidnappers would use payphones and call the Risso house. And what happened initially, I'm getting ahead of myself. So they take the first ransom note, they put it in an envelope, and they tape it to a utility pole in the parking lot of the local mall there, shopping mall. And they call the Risso home and say, hey, you can go to this place and pick up the note. So they do. And from that time forward, what was established was a mobile number that the kidnappers would call and, from payphones and speak directly to who they thought was an Exxon representative, but it was an FBI agent.
That number was set up specifically as a contact point for these kidnappers.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. And it's funny, they had a command post set up where, someone always had to man the phone. And I was told at the time that it was the first time, from a technology standpoint, that they were able to clone a phone. So they're able to clone this phone so that various agents had access to the phone. But so that first day, the note arrives at the mall, and of course they take it and check it for before they check it for fingerprints, they take it back to the Riso home, where they eventually set up a command post inside the home. It was a big house, and so you have FBI and local agents there. They're examining the note, and it asks for $18.5 million, 1992, which I say is equivalent to $34 million today. I mean, that's a lot of money. In fact, it's the largest ransom ever demanded in history. And so then they take the note immediately, and they drive from New Jersey to Washington, D.C. To take the note to the lab there. Now, that was the only time they did that, because Exxon's like, look, guys, we don't need you driving for 2 hours with a note. You can have access to one of our corporate jets. So Exxon lent the FBI a corporate jet to fly back and forth between the D.C. lab and New Jersey. So after that second day, what you had was you had the Riso home with the wife living there. The children, there were 5 children. One had died by that point, but there were 4 adult children. And they all arrived that first evening. And you also had a situation where a lot of the house was taken over by FBI and local authorities, but they just set up, kind of what you see on television. They got fax machines, computers, desks. They got things taped on the walls and diagrams and all that sort of thing. And so at the end of the first day, that's where they are.
So tell us what is happening. Yeah, tell us what is happening to Sidney Riso for those first couple of days.
Yeah, and this is it's one thing to be kidnapped, and I've read where victims of kidnappings were taken good care of, but unfortunately in this situation that was not the case. Mr. Riso was placed in a homemade wooden box inside the van. That's after he was shot in the arm. He was cuffed and placed in this box. His mouth was taped, his eyes were taped shut, and they had this rope lattice work within the box that more or less pinned him down to the floor of the box. So now, and then they close it, and there's 3 locks on the box, and they take this box in the van 30 minutes away out into a rural area where there is a storage facility, a self-storage facility, and they unload the box into a storage unit that's not temperature controlled. It's just a regular unit, and that's where he's going to be held. And he's going to be alone most of the time. The kidnappers are not going to stay there inside the unit. They just drop him there and then proceed about their daily life. These kidnappers in the note claim to be environmental terrorists, upset over the Exxon Valdez having wrecked in Alaska. And they posed in that fashion for a while, but they weren't, as you'll see in the book. And so they had, their daily lives. They were not totally concentrated on the kidnapping. They were doing other things. So they just dropped him in the storage unit. So I say, he goes from being one of the most powerful corporate executives in the world, and within 30 minutes, he's in a box in a storage unit, shot, mouth tape, eyes taped, hands cuffed, rope holding him down. He's in pain. He's probably in shock. And that's a terrible turn of events within a short period.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Now, because we're going to run out of time here, tell us about any attempts to pay the ransom. Was that ever tried?
Yes, this went on for a couple months, actually. And the first ransom drop was planned for 3 days after the kidnapping.
Okay.
And the kidnappers bungled that, and it didn't happen. So then, unfortunately, and they were spooked, and it took almost 6 weeks before there was another attempt at a drop. And unfortunately, it didn't turn out well for the kidnappers or for Mr. Riso.
Yeah, how long, do we know how long Mr. Riso stayed alive under those conditions?
Yeah, he died quickly.
Yeah, I would think so.
He had a systemic infection from the gunshot wound that was not treated other than by just alcohol swabs and that sort of thing. And he was given water, a little water every day, no food. And then for late April, early May, the temperatures rose uncharacteristically. And so the temperature within the storage unit, I was told, was tested at over 100 degrees.
Oh, geez.
So he's in this box, 100-degree unit, with very little air. And, the autopsy revealed that he most likely died from, a combination of dehydration, suffocation, and the systemic infection.
What do we know about the kidnappers? And in their minds, did they think they were going to be able to make this exchange quickly, get it over with? Because obviously they weren't prepared to care for Mr. Riso for any extended period of time. Or did they never, in your mind, have the intention of turning him over?
There's some question as to whether they did, but I believe they did intend to turn him over. I think they just... they thought that the exchange would happen quickly, so even if they mistreated him within 2 or 3 days, they would be okay. And I don't understand that mentality, but no, I believe they intended to make the exchange and then make a phone call, and they were going to leave him somewhere that he could be picked up. The original plan was that they would ask for this $18.5 million to be supplied in used $100 bills, placed in 10 bags that would be dropped at a train station, loaded onto a train, a commuter train there in New Jersey. The family were supposed to be involved in the drop. They would be using a cell phone and be told to toss a bag out at specified locations, and then the kidnappers would pick up the bags and go on their merry way. Which, of course, in the book, that didn't happen. They ended up being apprehended, although it did take 4 hours that night of the drop. It was a big affair. There were over 300 FBI agents involved, 50 or so local authorities, helicopters and planes, what have you. I mean, it's a very interesting and suspenseful time, even for me. They wanted the ransom drop to be in Mr. Riso's car. So 2 FBI agents posed as family members. Another agent of small stature, they tossed the spare tire out of the back. He crawled in under the bags of fake money. There was never any real money supplied. And he had a submachine gun. And so they were, ready for any circumstance, and it was a very tough night for everybody in law enforcement and the Riso family.
How do we know how long the kidnappers had been planning this? You said that they had been surveilling Mr. Riso. And for some time they'd trying to consider who their target would have been based on the options they had. But how long did they actually plan it?
Yeah, they planned it about 5 months. They started in December of 91 planning, and, the kidnapping was April 29, so it took about 5 months.
And how did they end up getting caught?
Well, they just did not realize that the technology and the manpower that would be supplied, because this area in New Jersey is somewhat rural, and it's a 3-county area where it was happening that night, because it was a situation where the kidnappers would use a payphone and tell the drop team to go from point A to point B to point C throughout the evening in this 3-county area. It, as I say, it took about 4 hours. And during this time, you had this small area saturated with law enforcement, either on the ground or in the air, and a lot of them were surveilling payphones, watching for anybody that might make a call from payphone. So finally, someone sees one of the kidnappers at a payphone, gets the license plate number, and they lose them. But later, by chance, which is in the book, just by chance, they end up meeting again, and the arrests were made at that point. And it didn't end there, because they were arrested, 2 kidnappers, and placed in separate jails. But they neither would speak about the kidnapping. They didn't provide any information. So then you've got law enforcement, the Riso family. They're in the situation where we've got 2 kidnappers that we were aware of, maybe more, but we don't have Mr. Riso, and the kidnappers we have aren't talking. So that was a big concern, and there was a third suspect that they thought was holding Mr. Riso and would make a deal, for the return of the kidnappers and the money in exchange for Mr. Riso. But when that didn't happen, then you're in a tense situation. A week passes, no Riso, nobody talking, and so a deal was ended up at the end of the day, a deal was struck with one of the kidnappers for a limited sentence in exchange for telling where Mr. Riso was, his body was located, and exactly what happened, how this came to be.
Wow. This is a fascinating story, and we're out of time, so we can't get into too much more detail, but the book is called Taking Mr. Exxon, the Kidnapping of an Oil Giant's President. It's going to be released on the 1st of May. Before I let you tell folks where they can get it, and before I let you go, Philip, if you had got a chance to write about another crime, another book, what would it be? Anything in mind?
That's a good question. No, it's funny. After these 2, I was done with true crime for a while. I might circle back and do that, but at this point, I have no idea. It would probably be something more contemporary. But these 2, were true crime, but they're also historical.
Right.
And with the Coors, not so much with Mr. Riso, but particularly with the Coors family, he was also a family dynasty involved, and so you had that aspect of it. But to answer your question, I don't know what it would be. I've just finished the manuscript and the rewrites on my 3rd book that is a historical nonfiction book, totally unrelated to true crime. So I don't know. But I would like to add that, for whatever it's worth, it's just another oddity to this odd story of taking Mr. Exxon, that before, I think it was before the sentencing, or certainly before the imprisonment, one of the kidnappers was interviewed by Barbara Walters on 2020. I don't know if you remember that show.
Sure, of course.
Maybe it's still on. I don't know. And she interviewed one of the kidnappers and ended up winning an Emmy for the interview. So there was just another strange event that occurred in this very strange kidnapping story.
Well, it is a very strange story. It's a fascinating one as well, and you tell it in very much detail in the book, Taking Mr. Exxon. Where can people find that book once it's released May 1st, and your other book as well?
You can pre-order now. You can wait. Release date of May 1, but as they say, it's available wherever books are sold. You know, you can go to Amazon, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, you know, where have you, and it should be there. It should be on the shelf May 1st, or you can order online now if you wish.
And you're going to give us a hint at what the third book is about? You said it's historic. It's about a historical event?
It is. It's, you know, if I can say this quickly.
Sure.
December 7th, 1941, everybody knows Pearl Harbor.
Yep.
What most people don't know is that the Japanese not only attacked Pearl Harbor, but they attacked several islands, including the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, Midway, Wake Island, as a coordinated attack, all happening within the same day as Pearl Harbor. And the U.S. did not have any planes in the air at that time, but there were 4 planes in the air, and they were Pan Am commercial planes in the air with passengers on board.
Okay.
And so the book, right now, the working title is called Stranded in the Sky. It's a story about these 4 Pan Am planes over the Pacific being caught in the first day of war on December 7th, and it's told from the perspective of the passengers and crew. It's not particularly a war book. It's just, you have wealthy, influential people on these planes, and they go from having a good vacation to being caught in the first day of war.
Wow, that's a great angle.
Yeah,
that's terrific. Well, again, Philip, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us tonight. You and I got off on a bit of a tangent to start the program, but that was a lot of fun too.
And I was lost in cyberspace out there for a moment too. So it's been an interesting night, but I appreciate it. It's been fun, and I enjoy. You've done a great job leading me along the path of this story, and I had fun tonight, and I hope you did as well.
I did. I had a great time, and I hope you'll agree to come back at some point. Maybe when the next book comes out, we'll get you back on.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks. Philip Jett. Again, the website, which I didn't mention before, is his name, Philip with one L, Philip Jett, JETT.com. You can get more information about all of Philip's work there.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by J.V. Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.